And tonight is don't put a stumbling block before the blind. So this is the fifth in this series, and there'll be one more of Mitzvot. That will be honor, fear your father and mother, and then there'll be a brief break, and then coming back.
Cool.
So you may proceed.
Sweet. All right, well, teaching to you, so we're gonna figure it out. The folks online.
We're here for you.
Yeah, I hear it. I hear you. I feel you. I hear you. Okay, so the text this week comes from two different places, but the major text is do not place a stumbling block before the blind. So you are we sharing it? You have the
Karen is ready to share.
Yes, Karen, can you just share it just to make life easy? So the question with this mitzvah it comes down to a couple of different things, which is how do you take it? Which is, we talk about this in so many different contexts of in a literal way, or is this kind of something else entirely from Torah? Like, what did it actually mean for Leviticus 19:14 to start off by saying, "You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear the Lord your God, if you will. I am eternal." Right? That is the text, and we'll look at the Deuteronomy 27 text in a moment. But I guess the question becomes is when you read that or when you hear that, forget the commentary at the moment from Rosh or anybody else. Is what comes to mind. Like, what is it actually telling you not to do? What is I realize it may be pretty self-explanatory, but what is the literal, what is this literally telling us not to do or to do, if you will? Either way. You're gonna have to have participation, or else it's not gonna fly. and Rabbi Mark, you're
Well, I don't know.
You're in it.
I don't know if it's literal so much as it is taking a look in general, that don't do anything to hinder people who are struggling, who have problems, difficulties.
Okay. All right. So the idea of, okay, so you've set up a group, and you said this group, for whatever reason, we're going to make sure that we're better to, we take care of, we're looking out for, we're being careful of. Okay. So even if we, for the moment, one of the things I always kind of felt is very interesting about Torah in general is we talk a lot about the widow, the orphan, the stranger, right? That gets, I'm gonna say, a lot of press, but that gets thrown out there. There are other subgroups, right? Like the idea that there would be this smaller group that would be set up that Torah as a law code would say you want to put in a separate group to make sure you're protecting, I think is really interesting. Like whenever you see that, I can't give you an answer as to the why necessarily, but the mere fact that Torah wanted to protect a group, I think says something, right? Because we do the same thing today, right? We have different classes of protected classes. We have ADA compliancy. We have all kinds of things that we double check ourselves to make sure that, like, as we renovated the building at Bethel, the bathrooms, you have a certain turn radius to make sure, right? You want to make sure that things are set up appropriately, and that you're doing this, that you're protecting a specific group of people. So that being said, you've got that here. So then the other, I guess the idea becomes, okay, so you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Okay, so clearly you could take this. Rabbi Mark is going one way right here. So not to go to literal, but to go to what have you. But there also is, kind of the literal, which is to say you're not going to actually do something to harm another person. It's like momish, like in dare I say, in front of them. Okay, fine. How you doing?
Hey, sorry,
You're
guys.
perfectly, listen, things come up, anything. So, okay. And then before we'll go back, but it also is interesting the fact that it ends the way it ends with which is you shall fear your God, right? Which is almost like as if to make sure you recognize, don't not everything ends that way. Not every single kind of law of what you're supposed to follow or not follow is going to end with you shall fear God. Kind of, this is, who I am. So the idea that it kind of puts that out there, I think is almost kind of an added, dare I say, emphasis on the fact of what this would speak to. So the question becomes is what else does it mean? If you say you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind, great. What else is there to it, right? If we take it literally, we're in one place. If we take it kind of metaphorically, we're in another. So what is the metaphorical understanding of the putting a stumbling block before the blind? We'll get to the commentators in a minute, but what else is there?
Well, I think it's a wider encompassing everything. Anybody that has any kind of a vulnerability, you don't want to exploit that and make life harder.
Sure. I mean, it's great. I'm sorry. I'm like trying to like pivot and looking at like what have you. Yeah, it's like you get nauseous. Yeah. So I think okay, yeah, to be considerate. Yeah, so absolutely, right? Like there's something about it, you're not exploiting somebody else's thing. I would joke, and although it's not really nor funny, but it's true, which is that like I know nothing about like so many things. Let's talk about cars, right? Like if you take a car to get fixed at the mechanic, there is a certain level of inherent trust, right? Because I have no idea what you're going to tell me is true, right? Like there is something to be said for the fact that like I'm putting everything in my hopes and my prayers, and the fact that when you tell me that it's the radiator, because I don't know where the radiator is, right? I don't know what the problem could be. And so the question actually is not only I don't think are we talking about the deaf, literally meaning, although the person who can't hear, but it's the person who it doesn't maybe know, right? Or even think that they know. And putting something up in front of them too, or perhaps, and again, I mean, that's the question. The question is whether or not you read it literally or you read it in kind of a metaphorical way. Yeah.
Maybe it goes further than that though. When I first heard this,
Please.
I thought, maybe they're talking about people that don't understand. Just because they don't agree with you, for example, that's not a reason to start making stuff up or get in the way of them expressing themselves, or there's any number of ways you could look at that. But I don't think it was meant to be just specifically for deaf people.
Oh no, I
don't buy that.
I would concur, right? I would absolutely agree with that. I don't think that for whatever the way I think that for the way I read Torah, I don't think this was supposed to be read literally. I'm sure there are people who do, but that no. And by the way, knowledge is a really interesting question though. To your point, like the idea that you would, what does it mean to put a stumbling block before somebody when it comes to knowledge or when it comes to learning, and like how does that happen, or how do you even remove such an impediment? Right? I mean, to your point of you're having a conversation with somebody you disagree with, or they don't have all of the facts, or they don't have that's great. Your job in some ways is to remove the stumbling block or to remove the impediment for them to be able to understand. I think at the moment it's kind of a funny thing that this almost becomes a how often do you get into a disagreement, maybe in the world we live in politics, or it could be on anything, on justice, on any number of things, where the person on the other side of the conversation, it's not that they're wrong, right? There's nothing they're saying that is inherently incorrect, but you wish they saw the world the way you saw the world. And the way you, in some ways, I probably often look at it is, if I could only remove the block that they can't, that's in front of them, that's in front of their eyes, they would see it my way. Right? They would see that I'm clearly correct, right? Their vision is in 2020, so therefore there's a dilemma, right? But that's, I think that's part of it here is what's there. But wait, there's also times that it comes up. I think that probably Berezin, this would be a funny one, which is probably better without probably our Orthodox colleagues. Not I have love and respect, but there's. It's not an uncommon insult, if you will, to be thrown at the liberal streams of Judaism, that the way we teach Torah is actually putting a stumbling block before the blind. Which is to say that when we read something in a more, liberal may not be the right way, but that we read things in a more open-minded, in a more general principled, in whatever you want to call it type of way, as opposed to being more strict a reading, that we're allowing somebody to follow something that actually isn't Torah necessarily anymore, right? And so that kind of gets thrown around a little bit in different ways also when it comes to this. So it's interesting.
Also not it's not kind to the people teaching it. It's also not kind to the people that are being taught.
Yeah, hands down.
So,
Hands down.
doesn't say a lot for people on either side of
No, it doesn't do much. It doesn't do much. So okay, so let's just look, when we do this, when we look at the Rashi text, and we'll see where I was like getting even more nauseous. Okay, so, well, because when you're not doing the scrolling, like
Yeah.
it gets it. All right, so big deep breath.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from Rashi. So I know only that one may not curse a deaf person, but from where do I know that this prohibition, right? But this thing that we're being told not to do includes cursing any person, even if he's not deaf, right? Because wouldn't that also make sense, right? Like, okay, I get that I'm not supposed to curse the deaf person, but the question, kind of like the shayla that you then say to yourself is, wait, if it specifically says I'm not supposed to curse the deaf person, does that mean that I
Carte blanche for
screw
everybody else.
screw the person who's blind? I mean, as long as you can hear and you can see, you're game. I can do whatever I want to do, right? Like, what's your fair game? Okay, fine. So therefore, Torah teaches us you should not curse among the people. But if this is so, and the kind of says the brackets so that the gremlins understand like what's actually being said, that this law is not exclusive to deaf people. Why does it say here a deaf person? So again, it's saying that it's not exclusive, meaning, okay, this is Rashi coming in to try and make sense of this whole thing. And he says the answer is just the deaf person is special insofar as he is alive, right? As the person actually, what have you. Likewise, one is prohibited from cursing anyone who is alive. This includes, by the way, I've always found this to be an interesting one. This excludes, cursing a dead person, for he is not alive.
It's important to know.
Well, I mean, I've read that clearly this Rashi a number of times because this text is like, I mean, you know, it's one of the, I don't know, it's one of the more popular. Yeah, exactly right. There you go. Yeah, I mean, the general idea of being, okay, so it's not just deaf, it started at the very beginning. It's not just speaking about deaf people, it's making of everybody. Number one. Two, you shouldn't be cursing anyone, right? Why? Because we're all alive, like we're all human beings, we all have a level, I think, of dignity and respect, or, you know, we would hope, or at least we would hope that'd be what we're shooting for. Fine. And then for it to end, like, I don't know, the ending was always very funny to me. This excludes cursing a dead person, for he is not alive. As if to say, oh, well, right, he was a schmuck, right? I mean, like, right? Because I mean, I think we're almost, I hate to say it this way, I think we're almost more, not kind, we're
Forever.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
to the dead.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I think there are, I mean, I don't know. I mean, think about eulogies in general. I mean, a hesped or a eulogy, I mean, I think the way we were, you know, it should be a real thing about the person, right? It shouldn't be, you know, grandiose and kind of just, you know, if the person wasn't, I mean, you know, you should speak true. You don't need to be rude, right? That's not what it's supposed to be. But the idea here that you don't curse someone, it's not about being deaf, but it's about being alive. But that the logical ending to that would be, well, then what about somebody who is dead? And for Rashi to kind of go off the end and be like, well,
Not alive.
they're not alive.
The person says, we're told not to speak ill of
Yeah,
the dead.
I mean, right, I mean, we are. And you know, cursing maybe, you know, I don't think cursing is what we take necessarily of, by the way, of you know, cursing, but it is an interesting thing. To be able to say that. So again, you've got this whole, you know, you got this whole thing here regarding what do you do? So what is Rashi coming in to end up saying? Okay, we shouldn't say anybody who is alive. And by the way, I'm not 100% sure. Oh, and just to be, I apologize that the way that they translated, you should not curse the deaf. Of course, we have as insult, which, by the way, regardless of the Hebrew for the moment, I think both probably work pretty well. But that I don't know, that is one of the ones that has always struck me as not being something that's very easy to not do. Right, like, just to go back for a moment. I don't know, but even in idle chatter, you did Lashon Hara last week, correct? Right, like, that's really tough. I mean, I think it's a reason the rabbis talked about all the time about the fact that you shouldn't like talk about like all kinds of other things, because you'll end up getting back to, I don't really like him very much. You know what I mean? Like, you end up coming back to the mundane of like life. And I wonder if that was kind of the reason they wanted to, they wanted you to stick to Torah, because at least they felt like you would stick on a path of talking about something. If you're always talking about the baseball game, fine. But at some point in the baseball game, you're going to look at the guy who didn't get the sacrifice fly, and you're going to say, what a moron, right? Like, you're gonna still throw that out there. And there was something about the idea of just being alive. I think, I think that was almost enough. Like, that was the lowest bar of being like, by being alive, you don't deserve to be cursed.
I always think it's interesting though, that like, when I read this Rashi is, okay, so if by deaf we mean anybody, and by anybody we mean because they're alive, then why need like, where, like, it's like almost cyclical in nature, like, why is it that we specify the deaf anyway, instead of just saying you shall not curse anyone, right? And because it's kind of a sort of like, why is the specificity there?
Right, why is it needed?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because Rashi's out, his when you read Rashi, you're always like, what is bothering Rashi about this? What is the rub for him? And the rub for him seems to be like the same question: why are we putting deaf in there? And but like, I'm not sure that I find his answer totally satisfying, and that, well, it doesn't actually mean deaf, what it means is alive. But for me, it's still like, I don't have a good answer to why we need that specificity of deaf. And so I'm not sure that we have great answers to this, other than, all of the different interpretations we've been talking about. And one of the things that I always think about here is, when we talk about the deaf person, do we really just mean people, like talking about people when they can't hear you? And like, and that's just not a physical thing, right? Like, can they not physically hear you? But if I'm outside of the room and I can't hear you.
Right, or just behind their back.
Behind their back,
Like
or.
a Nebraska nice.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. So where, like, what kind of deaf are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a really very thoughtful way to look at it. Right. We'll get the blind, which is a whole different thing as well. But to your point, right, deaf could just be the idea of the person, right? I mean, they're not in earshot, so therefore, as if they can't hear you, it's okay to talk about them or what have. Yeah. But the only thing about the dead that was always interesting to me was it about their dignity? So like, for the moment, the person who's outside the room has the ability to hear, but they're deaf to what I'm saying.
Right.
Fine. The person who's dead, I'm sure are people around them who are alive that could be offended if we speak ill will of the dead. Don't get, I'm told, but they can't physically, they can't be hurt, right? Right. I mean, their honor, I guess, that lives outside of them, I guess, could be hurt, but they can't be hurt. But that's in a really interesting way of
yeah, but I don't know, looking at it in this day and age of what happens when things come to light that need to be talked about posthumously, right? That, we find out something about somebody that is not kind, but is truthful. How do you, like, there's,
deal with it,
like, you still have to deal with it in a certain way. And so that has, like, that's the line between, I think, insulting and cursing, and also speaking the truth, and, kind of making reconciliations on certain things too.
No, I think that's for sure. So I think that gets to the deaf are putting a stumbling block before the blind. The question becomes, again, you say fine, and then the second part of it, as far as places stumbling block for the blind, I mean, really, which you think about just as far as here, right? So look at that second text, I guess we'll fourth down when you're looking at it actually. So the Rashi goes, before a person who is blind regarding a matter, you shall not give advice that is improper for him. Now, that first line was fascinating to me. And I always forget the gendered part of it for this, the moment, not to put that aside. That's of course just the translation for where I got it. But for the moment, it's improper for the person, meaning like, if you're talking to me, like for the moment, go back to the car example. If you're gonna talk to me about the radiator, you better use really, really dumbed down layman's language, right? You can't talk to me. I mean, we talked about, the building renovation. If you want to talk to me about how you're doing the roof to the siding, to the this, to the lighting, like we went through with the lighting guys to figure out like which settings the lights needed to be at. And we were like 100%, 75%, 50, 25 and off, right? Like, do not make this complicated, right? Because we will screw it up, right? Like, just make it
on and an off.
right, like make it as easy as humanly possible, right? Fine. But that's interesting, right? Because how many times you go into talk as fast as my brain is thinking. How often do you go into somebody and you meet with somebody who is incredible intellectual, but they actually can't speak to you because you are not at where they're at, right? You're an expert in something, they're an expert in something, but what they're talking to you about is their thing, and they're not making any sense to you because they're speaking way up here, right? My experience is the most brilliant people can actually make the most complicated things seem simple, right? So the idea that give advice is improper for him is in some ways, you got to speak to the person you're there. If you don't give the advice that they need to be able to hear, you're not giving them fair advice, right? It's what they need to be able to understand it and hear it. And by the way, I don't think this isn't there, but I would also tell you that I think that it would also be the fact of what they need to hear, not what they probably want to hear, if you're talking about the idea of advice, if you will. Okay, for instance, do not say to someone, this is like the Field of Dreams example, by the way, sell your field and buy a donkey with the proceeds, right? That make like you're going to give up everything you've got agriculturally, right? What have you, in an agrarian society, so you can buy a donkey, which by the way, I'm sure is a lovely animal to have, but nevertheless.
I'm not actually sure of that.
I know, I don't know. I mean, Shrek was cool, right? I mean, like, I take a talking donkey. I think that would probably put us some like whatever. Okay, well, in truth, you plan to cheat him since you yourself would take it from him by lending him money and taking the donkey as collateral, right? He will not be able to take the field because a previous creditor has a lien on it. So that's getting into details. But think about the idea of, I'm probably gonna get burned because someone on here is gonna be in this business. So I'm gonna apologize now. But like, when you talk to like stockbrokers that are fiduciaries versus that are making like pretty high commissions off of certain trades, right? And you're saying to yourself, wait a second, like, I want to know that you're looking at me and my 42-year-old self, and you're saying, what is it so that this kid is 65, 70 years old, could maybe like, I don't know, stop working 24, what have you. What's in his best interest versus I'm making like 6% off the fact that we buy that stuff, whatever it would be, like who's actually benefiting from the advice being given, right? Like, where do those things go? And I think that that's an incredibly important thing that fits in here is, when you're giving someone advice, you're giving them the advice that they need, right? That they need to hear. I think that's an incredibly important thing. I don't think it's certainly like speaking of somebody just as deaf. I don't think it's speaking of somebody who actually is blind, although all the more so. But you can't do something for your benefit, right? That the stumbling block is putting something before somebody that's going to make them do something either in error or what have you, that's not in their benefit. I mean, I've always felt like, yeah, it's so I'm curious other people here, please. I mean, is there a thing?
Bitcoin, she said it's like trying
Oh.
to Bitcoin. I know people just don't understand.
Yeah, I certainly am one of those people, yeah.
I always
Probably
think
because
of
of people selling it don't really understand it either.
No, everybody, the blind leading the blind.
Right there, that's a different
It's a whole
movie.
thing.
Yeah, that's definitely right.
one of the things I always think about when I read this, well, there's two. One is that, you know, when I go to, you know, a store, for example, right, and I'm trying on dresses or shirts or whatever you have, right? And
Sure.
the salespeople are like, you look fabulous. And I'm like, I've never looked uglier. Thank you. Like, this is the worst thing I've ever tried on in my life. I have no idea what you're talking about, but like, and
Yeah.
so you have to say like, okay, is it because they're earning commission? Is it because they genuinely like to make you feel good? Like, but where is this advice coming from? Because if they just, you know, see something and want to push you in a direction that you don't feel comfortable because maybe it's a look that you're not used to is
Well, that's
different,
That's interesting.
right? Like sometimes you go and people see something, you know, in you that is different than what your norm is, right? And you need a little push that.
So it's not that the shirt, I'm sorry, it's not that the shirt doesn't look good, it's that you've never seen yourself in that,
Right,
in
could
that
be.
color.
In that
whatever it would
color,
be.
right, like maybe that
Huh.
style is not actually the way that I see myself, so I automatically
Fascinating.
think I look terrible. And like, maybe what they're seeing is like, you know what, this actually is, if you can take a step back, like that actually is good for you. And they're pushing you in a direction that like, maybe you wanna go and that you need a little push to get there. Or maybe it's really that like, they get commission off of this item and they really wanna sell it because nobody else is buying it, you know? And that's different, right? But it's always, it's a kind of a question, like, it's like, are you putting a stumbling block in front of me, or are you trying to get the stumbling block that I'm already seeing like away, right? Because maybe it's really that, like, if I was looking at this objectively, I might see something different. So where is that stumbling block and what does it mean? And is always a question I have too.
That's really, I mean, I think that's a really cool way to look at it. You know, it's funny whenever I've seen this, that to not put a stumbling block for the blind was you know, okay, so you don't give bad advice. To your point, you know, you're kind of, I mean, literally kind of selling through your shirt. I mean,
Yeah.
whatever, you know, it's like, you know, you're doing all these things to kind of pump up or whatever, it's the commission or it's the stock or it's whatever it would be. That somehow at the end of the day, I think the reality would be is in this situation, it's I'm doing something that somehow is leading you astray and
Yeah.
benefiting me,
Right.
right? It's not as if this isn't a Robin Hood example.
No.
Right? This isn't like somehow society is being benefited at large by me trying to get you to buy the shirt, right? Like in fine. The other way to look at this though, which is the flip, which and I don't know why that this has just kind of always worked for me, although it is the inverse of what they said, which is how can you remove these things for people? Right? No different than the argument of you disagree with me and I'm saying I'm right, and if you clearly knew better, but it's also, you know, I mean, we both, I mean, left, you know, we're both of our synagogues right now, our high school students are hanging out and doing stuff. And earlier today, I mean, we're trying to give them the tool to do it, right? In education today, most of the way you teach is a kind of not a research base, it's a kind of, but it's kind of an investigation, right? You want to give the kids the tools to be able to learn. I mean, I think rabbinical school education was, they're never going to get through all of the books of all rabbinic literature. Like I mean, it's not a possibility, but you're given the tools so that you can open up these incredible treasures and be able to find what you're looking for at the time you need to be able to do it, right? So how can you remove those, you know, those things so that people can actually find their own and do their own learning and be able to kind of seek things out.
I apologize if you already said this, but it's maybe at the beginning, but there's a lot of interpretations of how, like, in terms of how do you remove a stumbling block. One of the big options is, or interpretations, I think, in the wider world is, you know, if you know that you have a person who's an alcoholic, right? You don't put wine in front of them. You do not offer them a drink. If you know, like there are opportunities that we have in life where we can remove stumbling blocks from people. We can take you know, we can take those things away and make it easier for them. Not just placing it in front, like not placing it in front of them, but to your point, removing what is the stumbling block. So if you have it, and I think that extends, right? If you know that that somebody is struggling with something, you don't deliberately put that in front of them, right? You take the opportunity to say, what is it that I can do to help remove what could be a stumbling block for you?
That's a really interesting thing. I remember, so in that, this must have been in the 80s or 90s. but the conservative movement, it must have been a thing, because for them to like write a paper about it, you know, it's like, must have been like becoming up like polemical, some type of problem. And there's other texts that are on gambling, but it became a thing that I think that synagogues, and I don't think it was specific to conservative,
I know you're not-
right? Yeah.
Yep.
So, and I love the game actually, but that being said, synagogues were renting out their social halls for bingo nights.
Yeah.
Which is lovely, right? Because what would happen? They would rent out the facility for bingo nights. And by the way, it wasn't as if the synagogue was, they weren't making any money off the winning, but if you came in the door, you paid whatever it was to sit down and play for 2 hours or whatever the thing was. And fine, and it became an issue that, to Rabbi Berezin's point, this idea that, you know, I mean, I'm not 100% sure that I would ever be playing, you know, as a gambling addict, that bingo would be my game. But that being said, I mean, to everybody their own. So that, you know, what have you, but you go to Iowa, you maybe slots, maybe the thing, but I don't know. But that was one of the reference points that it was a matter of you're kind of taking advantage of someone's, like their challenge, right? Like if you know, if to your point, if they're an alcoholic or whatever it would be, or they, you know, they haven't had a drink in 25 years, putting a bottle of Johnny Walker on the table, you know, is not like, that's not what you do. Right. And so that's an interesting kind of way to do it. But you also, going back, you also kind of wouldn't make, you also wouldn't mock them for it, right? You wouldn't think that, which is kind of an interesting way to do it. So again, I think both of these, you're talking about the depth of the blind, I clearly think that there's bigger than them individually as these subsets of people. But I guess the question becomes that also in society today, I think that what it means to be blind or to try and open other people's eyes is a really tough like conversation. I think so many people, or our own, to your point earlier, I think that to our own point, like we don't fully see, right? There's so many things in front of us that we just are not fully understanding. And how do we do that? I think the idea would be is we remove the stumbling block to be able to be there, but you certainly don't do it on purpose. So, okay. So this the second text, which is not the direct, it kind of goes right along with Leviticus 19:14, but it is just it's another text of the same kind of general idea, from 27:8 from Deuteronomy. It says, "Cursed be he who misdirects a blind person on his way." And then this was, of course, what goes, the curse isn't as well that everybody. So one thing about this text that I always found interesting was that and all people say amen, it's almost as if it wasn't like a gospel kind of choir type of situation. Thank you for at least what happened, like maybe you feel this better than what's going on the limb there. But that being said, like it was almost as if for everybody to say amen was that everybody had to hear it. Like, I want everybody to be clear that you've heard this law being said and being given, and then you're going to be like, we're all on board. Fine. But it's going the other way of here, right? It was putting a stumbling block. It was putting something that was in their way. This is almost even more blatant, or at least the way I read it, right? Like to put a stumbling block before a blind person is to put something that's going to make them trip. It's going to hinder their ability to get wherever they're going. And by the way, that could be in any kind of means, right? Of you know, from financial to knowledge to anything. But I think going back, this is a little bit different, right? Because this is, you know, better, right? There's something about this that's actually almost more, I find more painful to almost to read or to think about, because you know, as the person, if you're misdirecting somebody, it's somehow you know what you're like, you know what you're doing. I think it is possible that you could accidentally give poor advice. Okay, possible to give poor advice. Your intent wasn't to give poor advice, but you did. You gave poor advice, right? You said buy the thing, this thing went down. Okay, like, but it wasn't intentional. You were trying to help somebody out, it didn't work out. This to me is the fact that you're looking at someone and you're saying, no, like you're giving guidance to somebody that you know very clearly doesn't know, and that you know better, and that you know which way is the right way, because you know which way they were trying to head.
Slimy.
Yeah,
It's really slimy, like.
right, right? And so the Rashi goes into the same thing, right? One figuratively, again, I mean, because Rashi doesn't, I mean, kind of funny that he does not want to read this either, literally. Regarding some matter, somebody who's ignorant or someone who's inexperienced, and knowingly giving him, right, bad advice. So that's the, I think that's the kind of the interesting thing here is that how do you have in a society, and even amongst, I mean, I'd say so, you know, amongst the Jewish community, there has to be some inherent level of trust, like in the system. Like it goes back to that, I think, at the very essence of it, right? Like if you don't have a level of trust in the system, or in the people that you're with, or like the system doesn't work, right? Like, you know, I mean, credit works because there's some kind of level of trust that, like, you know, whatever, and you know, there's interest, whatever, you're paying something back, right? There's a trust in the system of how things work, right? I mean, you know, you build a beautiful building, right? People make a pledge, right? You have an inherent trust that these people are going to come through in this. Someone tells you they're going to pick you up at 4 o'clock and you're sitting outside the, you know, job because you what have you, right? There's a level of that, right? I mean, and that to me, I think, such an integral part of society, that I think that was the essence of where this was coming from. That like, if you, because the deaf person is reliant on others, right? The blind person is reliant on others. Like at some point now, I mean, I know now I'm reliant on others, regardless of being blind and deaf, but I can only imagine if I was. And so I think that's at the end of the day, like kind of what this goes back to, or at least I would contend, that there is something there that we all need, or that we all want. And how do we get to that place, right? I always kind of, you know, yeah. I'll pause there for a second, yeah.
You know, I think that, you know, it's not even people who are reliant on other, like you said, we are all reliant on others for something. I am completely and totally at somebody else's mercy when I go to the doctor, because I am not a medical professional, right? I am completely and totally reliant on believing what it is that they tell me. The same with the car mechanic, the same with like, there's just a lot of things in life. When the HVAC people come to my house and say, this is what's wrong, I say, okay, great, that sounds good. Like, I have no idea if you're right or wrong. And so somebody using their superior knowledge to their advantage and intentionally misleading anybody, we're all reliant on that kind of person. There is not a person in the world that knows everything about everybody or everything about everything. And so, you know, some people are physically reliant on each other. Other people are reliant on others in so many different ways. And so we all have to, I think there's a certain level of trust of saying, okay, I'm not going to purposefully take advantage of somebody just, you know, because I can, because that's not what it means to be a good member of society. What it means to be a good member of society is to do the very best I can for somebody else, because it's my responsibility to do that for my neighbor. You know,
Right.
And so it's just, there are some things in the Torah where I'm like, why is it that this has to be said? Because like, isn't this common sense? And yet, apparently, as we all know in life, there are things that we believe are common sense, like not intentionally misleading somebody, but because obviously it has been done before, you do have to say it. And you have to say amen, because like, not only does it need to be said, but you have to acknowledge that you heard it.
Right, yes, right, and that's, I mean, so the thing that's interesting, and there was a great, one of the questions, we'll get back to Debbie, the question in a second. How often, or not how often, maybe, or how that it's happened in the situation. I'll use my kids because it's kind of an easier example, right? Is that, you know, how often that, you know, they're going down a road and you see them, maybe the kids, the grandkids example, right? You see them going down the road And your question at that moment is, you see where the road is gonna go, right? I mean, you have maybe even lived this very road, right? You have been down this road, you've been going the same speed down the road, and you know, like, there's not, to the Josephus text at the end in some ways, it's not that you're supposed to gain a level of, to be able to look down at the person, or you're supposed to kind of laugh at the person going through it. It's because it could be very easy to kind of look at the situation and say, you don't want to do that because what have you, as if that gives you to the point of the HVAC person walking in, whatever, that gives you a level of superiority, right? That's not the goal, right? I think the goal is that you're actually guiding people on being able to make the better decision, for themselves, right? Which is a pretty interesting thing. The Josephus said, we must point out the road to those who are ignorant of it, and not for the pleasure of laughing oneself or to impede another's business by misleading him, right? Like that ends up becoming kind of the essence of this here. But I think, Debbie, to your question, is there a difference between not placing a stumbling block and removing one that's already there? I mean, clearly Torah is using it of don't do it, which is an interesting point, right? Because I would live in a world today where I would say we probably strive to do both equally, as opposed to, but to Berezin's point of like, we live in a world where like, why do some of these things have to be written down? Well, there's nothing new under the sun. The same thing that must have happened during Torah times, we still deal with today. So it's more important to say to us, listen, don't put the block, don't put the thing that's going to deceive another person, don't cause harm to the other person, don't put the thing that's going to make them screw up or make them lose money or cause them to be poor health or whatever the thing would be. Don't do that. Right? Like start there, like start at the bare minimum, the lowest barometer of like humanity. Don't screw them over, right? If you can manage to not do that,
And we can.
right, then we can then we can figure out how to like remove the stumbling block. I mean, that's fair, right? It's like, right,
So.
I hate to say it that way, but I think that like that lowest common denominator may be.
Get the bare minimum out there and then like, because I think that sadly expects more people, right? That, the bare minimum is don't make their lives worse, right? Like, don't do something that is wrong because you can. The next level up from that on the ladder, of like, is if you see a problem that you can help fix and not make worse for, like, not just not make worse for somebody, but actually help resolve, then you can remove that stumbling block. Like, okay, so this is an embarrassing example, but I'm gonna tell it anyway because it's pretty low. It's like, it was really like not a big deal, but like, so I moved to Jerusalem for my first year of rabbinic school, and I'm not entirely fluent in Hebrew at that point, and B, geographically challenged on a good day in a city that I grew up in. So a place that like I literally just moved in, not a chance. And it like, when I moved there, it was before smartphones, and I had like, I don't know, the same phone that has when I was 16 years old, like that old school Nokia phone, right? There was no chance that I was like
The best ring ever,
and the game Snake.
Yeah.
Excellent. But so I'm wandering around looking for this place that I'm supposed to be meeting some classmates at. And I'm wandering the streets and I'm looking because I've got my map and I'm trying to figure out where I'm going, but I'm pretty helpless with a map. So I start asking people like, where's Lincoln Street? Where's Lincoln Street? And like, I keep talking to the people and they're like,
Oh,
there is no Lincoln
that's
Street
funny.
here. There is no Lincoln Street here.
Funny.
And they would walk away and start giggling. And I was like, okay, like, yes, but like, I know there is a Lincoln Street here. Like the map says there's a Lincoln Street. Why are they laughing at me? Like, I'm not actually in the wrong space. Like I must be very close. Then finally this, American comes up to me and is like, okay, I'm gonna throw you a bone here. Like Israelis pronounce it Lincoln. And I was like,
the L is not silent.
the L is not silent to them. They pronounce it Lincoln Street.
When you spell it in Hebrew, when you transliterate it from English to Hebrew, that second L is there.
Yeah,
That's
like,
really,
I was
really
like,
funny.
Not only are they like,
That's Israeli. I mean, well,
it was so Israeli. It was
Yeah,
so Israeli.
yeah.
But like,
Wonderful people, by the way.
but like, I was like, I clearly am out of my depth here, right? Like, but not only are they like, they were certainly not removing the stuff, like they didn't place the stumbling block there. It's not their fault that like,
Right.
that
you were
the L,
clueless.
that
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
clueless, and that the L, it is silent and, in English is not silent in Hebrew. They didn't put that stumbling block in front of me, but they could have removed it and they chose not to, so.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and so like, there's those, I think there's those things, I mean, and there's the things I think that we look at.
It's very low bar.
No, but it's a great example, right? I mean, it's those kind of things, because those are things that are common.
Yeah.
Like, those are the things that like we pass by on a daily basis without like even, I think, batting an eye, like, or like, what have you, and we giggle at, but like, to your point, like, you were lost. Right? So, it's interesting. I think there's so many things that we look at as a community though, and we put stumbling blocks up. I mean, so for example, like, this is one that Omaha doesn't know from, right? But like, just using, real world examples. So like, I grew up in a town where like you paid for high holiday seats, right? Right, that was a thing. Right now, by the way, being a thing was that's how the synagogue survived. We can have a conversation about synagogue survivability in a different, that's a different sermon.
Still
But
pretty common in lots of places.
yeah, no, and it is. Lots of synagogues have rolled it into dues because they don't want to do it anymore. They still need the gelt's what they still need, right? That was the end of the day. But the point would be is, if you couldn't afford it, right? Well, well, either go somewhere else or like, there's the door, right? Like that, thank you very much. Like, and that was a stumbling block, right? You were putting something up as a barrier to entry. By the way, it's not the money part, but the knowledge pieces that exist between the reform and the conservative movement. Like, what would be the barometer of like, what people expected that they knew, right? Like, you walk into a reform synagogue service. The percentage of English to Hebrew is going to be different than walking into a conservative synagogue, right? A conservative synagogue, we do the prayer, we do the prayer for the prayer for the country in English, sermons in English. I don't know. That's about it, right? What have you? I assume the same thing for Beth Israel. That was gonna be a different story, and that's okay. But there could be an argument or a conversation. Like, are those? It's a stumbling block. You're not changing someone's direction, but the reality would be is, if you're trying to understand, if you're trying to feel welcome, it could be, right? And so those are things that we've set up, right? When we look at the cost of, my lovely kids, they're gonna go to Jewish summer camp. Right, like Jewish summer camp, you're $1,200-$1,300 a week to go to sleepaway camp. Like, it's not as, they're not, it's not as if they're like, these are for-profit industry. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, what are the stumbling blocks that exist in the community that we've set up? Not, by the way, on purpose. Right? It's nobody's fault that camp costs, but it costs. Food costs, but it costs. Transportation is what it is. It is what it is. There's no knock on it. But you wonder at that moment, like, what are the things that we have, that we've done kind of as unintentional consequences of certain actions to almost harm ourselves. This beautiful building, but there are opportunity costs for things. But it's an interesting kind of thing to look at. Like, what are those things that are there that you didn't even mean to be there? But I still think that society when you start with the lowest, and by the way, probably it's not always a good thing to start with the lowest common denominator when you're trying to make rules. I think you think about your own kids, right? You don't start with, don't hit. Like, maybe you should start with be kind, right? Like, let's what have you. But that was the way Torah kind of worked in this way. And maybe because of the fact, to your point, maybe that's what they were dealing with. And they said to themselves, listen, like, this is where we're gonna go.
There's so much of, if you look at any institution's bylaws, right? So many of those are reactionary to something, and you look at them and they all tell a story, because some of them, are very foundational, but there are others that are so particular to any given community that you have to ask yourself, what was happening that caused this to be put into actual bylaws, right? And if you think about Torah in many ways, right, this is
our bylaws.
These are our bylaws. These are the story. This is the story of how we become community to each other. And so, at a certain point, however you believe the Torah came into existence, You know, there's the question of why does this have to be said? Well, clearly something happened or something was happening that needed to be addressed to make sure that it would not continue in that way. And that's always like, you know, we look at this and we look at so many other laws in the Torah, like, why is kashrut a thing, right? Is it because it's one of those laws that we will never understand? Or is it because of X, Y, and Z other societal reason that people have come up to explain why kashrut exists, right? So why is that do not put a stumbling block before the blind? Do not curse, you know, cursed is the person who misdirects the blind person. You have to wonder why it's there and what is the purpose and what is the deeper meaning of how is it supposed to guide our lives?
Yeah, I mean, so I agree wholeheartedly. I think that question, that kind of, I think that the kind of intellectual curiosity for Torah is also a kind of, I mean, and that's what makes the asking the questions really important. And again, here, there isn't a straight up answer, but it is interesting that kind of the way that at least Rashi kind of takes us. Clearly, Rashi himself wasn't ever reading this as just deaf and blind, which I think tells us something about how we read Torah to begin with, right? Which I think is not pardon the pun, but like eye-opening in some ways, right? Because that's important, because there are lots of things that we're supposed to take literally, right? But apparently we can also take certain things figuratively as well, which is interesting, right? Like you know, he certainly is choosing to do so. But the second just becomes, I think, you know, maybe as we're kind of like, you know, wrapping up here, is the idea is the question I like to ask myself when we're looking at this text is, how do you, I think, and it goes back to kind of to Debbie, to the question that was posed, is what can you do? Like, what are the things in your daily life when you can pull out the stumbling blocks, or at least not put them there? And the hardest one would be is, and I really think this, I mean, is one that is just overwhelmingly difficult though, is doing this while also being like brutally honest, right? Like when you watch, I mean, I mean, politics are terrible, but like, you know, you watch speeches, you watch all these kind of things, like it is a, I don't care what side we're on, it doesn't matter, the politics in general, it is a soup of misguided rhetoric, right? And that's like, if you are the person sitting there trying to digest it, trying to make like I'm actually caring about like civility at this moment, right? I want to like vote for the right person. Like, all I want to know is what are you gonna do, or what is the actual problem, right? You know, what are we trying to solve? And you're in this soup of not knowing. And I think this goes to that, right? This goes to the idea of like, what would it be to live in a society where like you could have 2 different parties, you could have 6 different parties. I mean, moved to Israel, you got 20 some different parties. But the point would be is that at least what you're being given and being told is, you know, is straight up. Whereas I think that we've all kind of got a layering of like cynicism and around us now, because we don't know what we're being sold, right? And that's a problem, right? I mean, it's not, and this isn't a matter of television, I mean, channels and all that. I mean, it's partly because of them, but that is the dilemma, right? Is that you can't tell where the block or where or who is misleading or misdirecting the blind is, right? I mean, and that's in society like now. And so I think that's really the question, is like, in Judaism, we pray 3 times a day and we aspire for the prayers we say. It's not a matter of like that we say these things and we say to ourselves, okay, we say these things because we think that's the world we live in right now. That's not the goal. The goal would be is we're saying these things as if to say we aspire that one day the world will look like A, B, and C. And this is in some ways the same thing. What would it look like in some ways if that wasn't there? And we may disagree on something, that's okay. But at least we're arguing over, you know, whatever the facts are, right? It isn't, the entire game isn't about who can mislead to the greater good to get the most amount of votes or what have you. I guess that would be, and that's, you know, that's what, I guess it's an unfortunate reality that we live in at the moment. But maybe we can, you know, the goal would be to not be there. Oh. Oh, it's not up there. And what responsibility does the blind or the deaf person have in all of this? be in a literal or figurative interpretation, as we casting this victim. Oh, it's really interesting. I mean, that's it. Yeah, I mean,
We've been talking about them.
the other, right, the other, yeah, I mean, that is an interesting point. I mean, kind of quickly is, you know, I wonder about that. That's kind of an interesting way to look at it. That they're cast clearly as the victim and kind of blameless in all this. You know, the reality would be is you do have a certain level of curiosity that you're supposed to have, right? I mean, you're not supposed to kind of be aimlessly, you know, Rabbi Berezin's point, like, at least she had her map, right? Like, you may not be able to use the map, you may not know which way north, south, east, west, right? But you had your map, right? I mean, like, you at least trying to do your due diligence, right? I mean, and I think that that's the thing. By the way, I mean, I laugh at that Jewishly today. You know, people talk about, you know, wanting to learn more, wanting to know more, what have you. And it's like no time in the history of humanity has Judaism been easier to find, right? Like there was a time, for example, I mean, we were probably in school, probably about this time, like when the Talmud was being finished, the Sensina was already done, but like the Art Scroll Gemara came out, the Koran edition of the Talmud came out in an English translation. Well, like the minute that happened, like it was insane, right? Because Judaism and Jewish teaching became flat. Like anybody could open up the Talmud, which is, I mean, an insane thing to think about, because this was like the thing that was left for, like, I mean, forget, like, even, I mean, with all due respect, this looked like the scholars of the scholars of the scholars to be able to like parse and figure out and talk about and discuss. And now you like open the entire Jewish world. Like you talk about removing, so, but the idea would be, I think, at least for here, the way I'm reading, like we read the deaf and the blind, you've now removed it. Like the impediment's gone. So now I could be deaf and I could be blind, or I was, now you've removed all those things. Am I still going to be curious?
Right, and how do you take on the ability to, is it your job at that point, once the barriers are removed, to still
Right.
to go and learn, or is it still, like, this is a very passive way of looking at it, right? That your I want to say fate, but that's not the word I'm looking for, but like your fate is left up to somebody else doing the good, like doing good in the world.
Right.
I think what Cindy's saying is like, we don't all have to be passive participants in our lives, regardless of what we know or don't know, like carry the map.
Yeah.
Open the Talmud, and if you have questions, ask them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So what you're saying is, don't put your head in the sand.
Don't
Is
put
that
your-
correct?
Hands down.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I would say that was, I mean, while not a principle that was elucidated exactly that way by the rabbis, hands down. Right? Like you can't, that's not the way to live your life. That doesn't mean that you can't at times, to the betterment of probably your own anxiety, look, you know, not to anyone's detriment. But like, I can't watch the news anymore. Right? I took a year off, right? I read the paper, I read multiple papers. I just can't do it.
No doom scrolling for you.
Yeah, right. I mean, I read too much, but yeah, it's, you have to do certain things, but you can't, right? You shouldn't put your head in the sand. And if that's what this, I don't think that's, in that case, then the blind or the deaf person would be at fault. So, yeah. It's such a wonderful room, and the snacks here are like really delicious. Like they have soda, they got cookies, they got Hershey bars.
Coffee.
We got like real stuff going on here. So like you should come
Wanna see
come hang out when you can, if you can.
Well, thanks for learning with us tonight, guys. Mark,
Thank you both for being
do you have
here.
any closing?
Thank you.
Awesome. Karen, thanks for running this.
Thank you, Karen.